Good morning, afternoon, or evening, folks, and welcome to Cast of All Trades, the show where we talk about developing skills, exploring ideas, and following curiosity. I'm your host, Orion Siebert, and in this episode, I'm joined by Joe Hilliard, a best-selling dark fantasy author known for his series The Warminster Saga. What separates wannabe authors from published authors? How do you world build for fantasy? And what skills go into making a best-selling novel? Joe started writing professionally when COVID hit, and he's been able to turn it into a successful career. In this episode, we discuss what went into making the Warminster Saga, tips and strategies for aspiring authors, and interesting opportunities that authors may face or other ways for them to profit. This episode was great, and I enjoyed chatting with Joe about writing and publishing, both from very different perspectives, him from a more traditional publishing side and me from a more indie side. If you want to learn from more expert interviews like this one, then make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. I believe that about covers it. So without further ado, introducing J.V. Hilliard. Joe, it's a pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you very much for having me. I much appreciate it on my end too.
Of course. So to begin with, I would love to hear your story. Who are you? What is it that you do? And how'd you get started?
Yeah, so I am a fantasy adventure author, and I am the author of the award-winning series, The Warminster Saga. It's epic fantasy meets dark fantasy. So if you're fans of Lord of the Rings, meets a little Game of Thrones, meets a little Gothic. So if you're a vampire fan or you're a Dracula fan, you're going to see some of that in there. Not vampires as much as the Gothic, but it's a 4-book series. The fourth in the series comes out here in April of 2024, and we'll close out the series. And then I've got a handful of standalone novels that will follow, sort of tracking the origin stories of all of the favorite characters in the series. And then I've recently licensed the intellectual property of the series over to a video game company to make an augmented reality and virtual reality game out of it that should be released in 2025. And I'm also working on an adaptation for graphic novels for you comic book nerds out there like me.
Well, that's awesome. Definitely, I just finished reading the first book, like maybe an hour before coming here. One, loved it, great. And I saw so many inspirations, or I could feel aspects of it that I thought, that reminds me of The Lord of the Rings, or that reminds me of this other property. And the best way I could describe it to the people I was talking to was, to me, it feels like The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson meets The Witcher, except much slimmed down, but very good, loved it. So how'd you get started with writing and being an author?
Well, it started at a really young age. My uncle was a Marine. He was paralyzed in the war. Came home and he was a second father to me. My mother was his nurse and took care of him, and he had very limited physical ability. So one of the things he could do was use his imagination. So we ended up at a very young age for me playing Dungeons and Dragons when I was around 10 as a form of escapism for him. But it really got me latched into the fantasy adventure realm pretty tight from a very young age. And then, also he was a writer. That's one of the things that he could do. So he wrote short stories primarily for like pulp fiction magazines and, like horror mags and stuff like that he would write. And I fell in love with just writing in general. And then, life got in the way. I went to college. You get a job, you get married, you have a family, you got responsibilities.
Be a normal, responsible human being.
Yeah,
Society likes to push on people.
Yeah. So I kind of put it aside, and then when COVID hit, I had nothing to do for about a year and a half. So my day job was that of a defense lobbyist, and DC was shut down for almost 2 years, and everything became remote. So I had all this spare time on my hands. I didn't have to travel. There was no hotel stays, no airplanes or anything like that. And I just used that to kind of memorialize years and years and years of Dungeons and Dragons adventures into what I thought was going to be a standalone novel. And then when I ended up getting it published, my publisher was like, no, this is going to be a trilogy, which turned into a quadrilogy. Which ends here coming up in April. So I was excited about that. But I'm a COVID author, like many out there like me. I would not have gotten back to it if it wasn't for that. And so if there was a silver lining and all that, that was it for me. I was able to kind of switch careers, midstream and do something that I really enjoy doing.
I gotta ask, what edition did you start on of D&D?
I was the old school box set original, like AD&D, like
Okay.
first stuff back in the day.
Hmm.
And play. We advanced. I still play with my nerdy friends on Sunday nights 6 to 10, and everybody zooms in and because we're all scattered around the country now, but
Hmm.
we still play. Just like friends would get together to play poker or watch football, we get together to play D&D, and we're using fifth edition right now, so we always upgrade with the
Hmm.
with the next keeping up with the Joneses as we play. So but always enjoyed that. And I played other role-playing games as well in and around the edges there, like Robotech was a good one. I've played Star Wars, Star Trek, the top secret games that or Gamma World or
Hmm.
Boot Hill from the old TSR days, and of course Magic the Gathering. I've always been involved in some form of that entertainment circle and art form, and just love it.
Hmm. Agreed. After we record this tonight, I have a D&D session to hop to that we've been doing for years and absolutely love it. There's something about group storytelling that it feels different. Do you ever draw any inspiration from D&D in your campaigns that you've been doing over the years?
100%, right? It's I think you're right. So as a verbal storyteller and a dungeon master or game master, um, you hone your craft, right?
Hmm.
And you also see how players react to the scenarios that you've built for them, whether it's a plot line, battle scene, horrible monster you've created, um, anything, right? All the struggles that they go through as they level up, and it's battle tested, right? You get to see what works and what doesn't work. And as an author, taking that and turning it from a verbal communication into a written form, and memorializing not only the campaigns that you might have played over years, but also picking the cherry picking the best of the best, right? So like I know this one worked because all the players were looking at me and I could feel that everyone was on the same page. Or I'm going to knock this out because this one it didn't work right, or
Hmm.
this character was a little weird or edgy or didn't make sense, or their name wasn't right, and I'll change their name for the sake of having a better name that fits into my realm. But I find inspiration from that all the time, and not just that. You named a few of them, like the Brandon Sandersons of the world, the Witchers of the world, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, standard Dungeons and Dragons stuff, but also taking a little bit of inspiration from some of the sci-fi stuff that I've read too over the years. So
Hmm. Absolutely. Having a table of people that you can talk to. It's almost like having beta readers before you even start writing. You can just
yeah,
beta
that's
testing.
exactly what they are, right?
Hmm.
They are beta creatives.
Hmm.
They're there for you to bounce ideas off, and that helps me really kind of break through writer's block at times. I'll share an idea with my friends, and even though they're not writers, they'll tell me what they think and what they don't like about certain things and what they really do like about certain things. And you listen to that because, that's your target audience, right? So for me, I think that's a perfect way not only to, say, hey, this is where I'm thinking of going with this plot line or with this character arc, but also, what do you think about this battle scene? Or can you read this for me and tell me what you think? Am
Hmm.
I on par? Does this make sense? And that's always been a big help for me as a writer.
Of course. So before we dive into more about the Warminster Saga and other stuff that you've done, I have one question that I have overarching over everything else, and that is what separates the wannabe authors from the actual authors? The people who say, "Oh, I'm gonna go write this book," compared to the person who actually puts pen to paper, or I guess nowadays it's fingers to keyboard. But what really
Yeah,
separates those people?
I think it's resilience and muscle memory, right? So part of it is uh, being able to execute on a plan, right? So for me, I get up and at some point every day I write something, and whether it's one paragraph or four chapters, that muscle memory that you get, I liken it to, going to a gym.
Mm-hmm.
Like the day that you don't go, you feel like you're out of shape, like you missed it, you feel guilty about it. And, for authors, that's important because many of us, especially published authors, have deadlines. You have to meet certain criteria that your publishers want, and therefore you have to keep pace. And if you write every day, no matter how small, even if it's editing something you've written before, it helps you. It helps you stay on pace. It also keeps it fresh in your mind, so you're not forgetting where you are, and things like that. And on the resilience side, I think really a lot of folks think they've got a great idea, and then they get into it, and there's a idealistic vision of what an author is. And if you can go to a bookstore and drink your coffee and or sit in your nook
Go to the
and write,
cabin
and
in the
that
woods, tucked away from
yeah,
the rest of the world.
and that sounds great, and there's an idyllic kind of connectivity to it, but that's not the way it works. Like I tell people this all the time. I mean, I teach a class at a local community college, and last night one of the questions that came up was, what how do you keep moving? And I'm like, really, this is a team sport, because it's just not me doing it. I'm sharing it with my copy line editor, my development editor, my publisher, my final editor, a handful of beta readers, an illustrator so that he or she can illustrate the book correctly, a blurb writer that's going to help me take my 140,000 words and distill it down into 250 for the back cover of the novel, and all by the time you're said and done. I've even had a poet, that I'm not good at writing poetry, and she stepped in to help me write poetry. I have people that have offered suggestions to me at conventions and stuff like that, because they want to see certain things happen. And you take all that into account, and you realize you're just not alone. But it isn't you sitting in a coffee shop and drinking your coffee and writing your book alone. It's really a team sport, which I think at the end of the day, that's why you'll see so many of those author acknowledgments in books that are 2 or 3 pages long. It's because it's really true.
Mm-hmm.
People sacrifice a lot to be part of that. And even just reading it and telling you, hey, I don't like this chapter for this reason, that's helpful. And you just have to be open to constructive criticism when it comes to that. And don't look at it as like they're upsetting you, or they're saying something negative about your book. They're trying to make it better for you. They're telling you where you're falling down. And sometimes as authors, we get nose blind to it because we're so close to it all the time. And it's like things have already happened in our head, but we never really wrote them down. And there's that disconnect. And that's what your development editors are for, or your beta readers are for. They're going to tell you this is what you're missing. And so I always tell people it's a matter of this stick at it, that resilience coupled with that guilt you feel when you don't write, and it. Not everybody's entitled to a vacation or holidays or whatever. I'm not saying that's the case, but you hit that wall, and all of a sudden it's like 2 years had gone by and something's still sitting in your drawer that you didn't finish, or in this case in a file on your computer, and you're like, oh, that great idea I had, I didn't do anything with it. And I think that's what separates the wannabes from the doers.
Absolutely. I can see that we come at this from very different perspectives. Because I do more indie writing, indie author stuff, where I am the only person working on it, whereas you're coming at it from the perspective of someone who's worked with a publishing agency, from the sounds of it, with more editors, more staff to back you up. And I love getting these different perspectives on things, because even as someone who likes to work alone on books, I still have people that I go talk to about my ideas to say, what do you think about this? Is this phrased properly? Or because I can't do everything up in my own head. And if I do, it's just going to be a book for me, and no one else is going to like it. No one else is going to care about it. And it's just not going to be a good book. It
Yeah,
really is.
I
Really is a team
100%.
sport.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And and there's something to be said about the indie author, right? It's like the indie anything,
Mm-hmm.
right? First of all, you're out there on your own. You're on an island, and it's all up to you. And I respect that. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur by trade. I own several businesses, and as a result, I know what it's like to be on an island, and I respect people that also are on that island, and the value of you keeping everything for yourself, good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
You make sales, you keep 100%. You don't make sales, you don't keep anything, right? Like or something goes wrong, and and that's why I think that from my perspective, I getting into the game, if you don't know the horse, you don't make the bet, as my uncle used to say. And what he meant was, if you don't know anything about publishing, and being someone that's jumped into a couple of businesses in areas of the marketplaces where I do understand, I wanted someone there. I wanted that backup plan, but I sacrificed a lot for it. I don't have autonomy. I don't get the royalties that indie authors do, and it's not always my say. But coming back at it, there's a lot of good things with that. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to indie versus
Mm-hmm.
traditionally published. I just think it's what you prefer. And I've actually started to do some indie publishing using Kindle Vella as a tool to allow me, because I have a tendency to write very dense and thick Tolkien-esque kind of writing. And when you're writing something that's in a short episode, the episodic stuff that you find with Vela, it forces you to write succinctly. And I'm uncomfortable with that. So I made myself do that. And I found I had a pretty popular book when everything was said and done that I'm now going to publish here in the summer, and release it through Amazon on that. And I'm doing it indie, and I'm trying that out too. The entrepreneur in me wants to be indie, but the Spock in me wants to be published because I know what I don't know, and I need help there, right? So I get it.
Yeah.
I get it.
Different strokes for different folks. It works great for some
Yep.
people, works horribly for others. Honestly, both paths are just as valid, and some people do great at one, but do horrible at the other. It's like, just try things out, see what works.
Yep.
Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. But I would love to hear more about your series and the upcoming final book in the Warminster Saga. So I was hoping that you could tell me a bit about the series, then we can maybe dig into a bit more of the technical side, well, the technical aspects of your writing, and maybe explore some of the business and like the business aspects of authorship. So, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So the Warminster Saga is a 4-book series that begins with the first book, The Last Keeper. And in The Last Keeper, you get a an epic struggle between the chosen one and Damus Alaric, who's a young prophet, and a false prophet, a man known as Great Taurus the Mad, who was part of Damus's sect, but he used his powers of prophecy and foresight for his own personal gain. And as a result, their god cursed him and not only took his physical sight from him, blinding him, but also stole his metaphysical sight from him. And Damus is part of this sect that known as the Keepers, and the Keepers are the only, they're the ones that are kind of like maesters, to use a Game of Thrones term. They're trained at the Cathedral of the Watchful Eye, and then they're sent amongst the people, to advise them on things that they'll see coming. But Damus is the only keeper that sees the return of the fallen keeper. And as a result, this epic struggle between the two that starts in book 1 and ends in book 4, begins. And so, I've always liked the concept of, these epic struggles, and Damus can see things that are about to happen that no one else can, but he looks at it as a curse, when really at the end he realizes it's a blessing. And sometimes that's a double-edged sword. In the beginning, he looks at it as, I'm a frightful, new adult. He's not a teenager anymore, but he's never been outside of his cloister or outside of his noble home. And here he now comes face to face with this despotic, vengeful man who's coming back to take his vengeance out on his old sect and what that means to the realm. And that's really where it starts.
Yeah, it's the young Luke Skywalker being exposed to the great empire and starting his journey.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And you're not sure what to do. And of course, he follows sort of that same sort of hero's journey that Luke does. And so if you're familiar with like the hero's journey stuff, I mean, in this case, someone doesn't find him in the sense that there's an Obi-Wan, or Harry Potter's, hero's journey starts with Dumbledore coming to Harry's aid. Instead, it's a series of people that all play a role to help Damus get from where he is to where he needs to be, so that he can stand up against this force that is known as Great Taurus the Mad. So, it's a my little spin on the hero's journey meets this tragic tale of the chosen one versus the false prophet, and you let at it, with all these great battle scenes. I've tried to do things that other people haven't seen in fantasy before. Look, it's hard to do that, but I've always, because you create your own world when you do these things. But I've tried to mix in a little sci-fi. I've mixed in a little, especially in book 4, The Echoes of Ghostwood, the final version. There's a group of wizards that show up, and imagine just instead of 500 archers, you've got 500 wizards on a battlefield, and stuff like that. And it's just a lot of fun. And I saw you smile there, so I know that that's something that, it's just great to think about what that would look like on a movie screen one day or in a video game. For
I have
me,
friends who I debate wizard spells with, to say, like, well, what would that look like, having a massive army of wizards actually going against each other? Are they coming up with new, like, is this wizards playing pranks on each other where they're essentially trying to outspell one another, where they're creating spells specifically designed just for ignoring one other person's kind of magic, and just this weird wizard nuclear arms race or Cold War or whatever madness might come of it? Yeah, it's
No, it's good stuff, man. And that kind of thing, I love the idea of having like this special forces unit of wizards that, for lack of a better term, or to use a D&D term, like teleport in, and either can wreak havoc or they can save the day, right? And in this case, I'm not going to tell you what they do, but ultimately, stuff like that. I think that's fun, and I try to take some of the monsters in the novels, and I take I take inspiration from traditional mythos from around the world. So you'll see things from Native American myths, Norse myths, African myths, some Chinese myths, and things like that. And so that there's some grounding of realism in them, because it's a story that you're kind of sort of familiar with, but at the end you're like, oh, this is a cool new fresh twist on this creature. And I can't help it, but I got to say this: sometimes the right music helps you create weird stuff in your head. So one of my
absolutely.
writer's prompts is listening to the right kind of music at the right time.
Mm-hmm. So do you have a personal like playlist that you'll go through when you're writing or sitting down to write, or is it just a
Of course I do. Of course I do. Now, the list changes depending on what I'm about to write, right? If
mm-hmm.
I'm going into a battle scene, I'm not listening to Louis Capaldi, but if I'm doing a romance scene, I'm not listening to Metallica or Five Finger Death Punch. But I am listening to them at certain times to help me get in the mood to write certain things. And some authors smoke a cigar, drink a beer, have a glass of wine, grab a cup of coffee. Some watch their favorite movies, some talk to friends and come up with ideas, and then they go and write. But and everybody has their own writer's prompts. And for me, listening to the right songs, sometimes in the right order. And I'll tell you what starts it: the theme to Conan the Barbarian. There is
mm,
nothing better. If you want to write anything in fantasy, you put that on for the 2.5 minutes it'll play, and you are steeped in it, my friend. You are in sword and sorcery land the entire way. And I don't care who you are, how tired you are. The minute you hear that song, or that, I don't know what, it's not a song necessarily. It's a classical display. You hear that, all of a sudden it's like, well, Conan wouldn't stop. Conan wouldn't sleep. He would get up and push that wheel of pain. He would survive the tree of woe. I got to get up and write. That's all I have to do is write.
mm-hmm.
Fingers on a keyboard. And this guy's pushing. You're like, all right, I'm up. I'm ready to go. It's the same thing. We get to the gym, throw that on. You'll be lifting weights.
Got your hype song ready, good to go. So we've talked a lot about inspiration. You've mentioned some of the things you've been inspired by to bring into your book,
Yeah.
well, into your books. And a question I have that I think about a lot as I'm working on short stories of my own is, where do you draw the line between inspiration and plagiarism, for lack of a better term? But where do you draw that line there? Is this too close to the source material or to the source thing? Or I don't know. I don't have a better way of phrasing that.
Well, sure. No. Well, the real answer is you'll know when you do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when you've entirely ripped somebody else off, that that's plagiarism. But you can always find inspiration in places. I mean, I talked about Harry Potter before. I mean, the old tropish hero's journey, right? Like Luke Skywalker lives with his uncle and aunt and is an orphan, and he lives in the desert, and the old man comes and rescues him and tells him he's more powerful than he's supposed to be. And then he rises up against this ultimate evil, and has to get this cast of characters around him to help save him. And at the end, he makes a few mistakes, but he atones for those mistakes. And at the end, he becomes the hero and defeats the bad guy, which is Darth Vader. Well, the same story is Harry Potter, right? You have Harry Potter who lives in the closet with his aunt and uncle who's an orphan, and Hagrid shows up at his house and takes him away to this world where he gets trained to be a wizard to fight he who shall not be named, and is helped by a crew of people named Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger and all these other people, just so he can beat he who shall not be named. And that's Darth Vader. Well, no, it's not really Darth Vader, but is that plagiarism? No, it's inspiration, and you
Mm-hmm.
created another story. And that's why tropes work. There are all sorts of tropes that people use and bake into stories because people like seeing them again and again and again. So you're a romance reader, and enemies to lovers, how many times do we see that? it's the same story just told with different characters. And that's what we're doing here, is we're creating something that's new. Like, my characters aren't in Middle Earth, they're in Warminster. And you're not going to find Sauron, but you might find Grey Taurus the Mad, or you're not going to find Uruk-hai, but if you're playing D&D, you find orcs, and in my world there aren't orcs, right? So, but there are Trollborn, and things like that, which are these mixed races and things. And so you try to do things that people haven't seen yet, but it's okay to be inspired by other things you've seen, because good stories, good songs, it doesn't matter where it's coming from.
They'll build on
There's
each
always
other.
Yeah, that's right. It just helps you fuel the fire, and as long as your story is unique, then you're good to go.
Mm-hmm. So you've touched a bit on some of these characters and some a bit about the world. How do you go about doing your world building? I feel like that's a question I hear a lot from people, both in the like tabletop role playing scene and in the fantasy or just fiction writing in general. Of, oh wait, how do I world build? Where do I start with that?
Yeah, for me, there's a bit of a cheat. I got a cheat code, which is I've played Dungeons and Dragons,
Give me all
right? And
those
I've played
sweet cheat
Dungeons.
codes.
Oh, it's for 20 years, man, right? So, like, you
Mm-hmm.
have all of these great stories, some better than others, some characters better than others, some villains better than others, that have been floating out there that you've been playing. And over that time, I've memorialized them. I've kept character sheets into the parties that they were a part of, and I've taken notes and maps and things like that you remember, and then you can refer to those things to build out your world. So there are places in my world that are really from my D&D campaigns. Others are brand new, but it's stuff that you've thought of over the years, where, like, oh, wouldn't this work, for this campaign, or wouldn't this make a really good story, or I haven't seen this kind of terrain before, and can we make something new that no one has seen? And then you build around that. So for my world building, there's a couple of things I do that's very specific, and other things that are organic and have a life of their own. The specific stuff is when you look at a place that worlds that stick with you, the good ones, whether it's Star Trek and the Federation, or Star Wars and the Empire, or Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth, or Westeros for or Shannara, or Forgotten Realms, or whatever you want to say. You remember them because of things that are unique to them, right? So you have to create things like, is the sky blue? How many moons or suns are there? And all that's fine, in the territory and the terrain and where the story takes place. You can build that stuff out, but there needs to be a pantheon of gods. Or is this a godless society? Or what kind of magic do you have? Is the magic inspired in the same way that you pray for it and your gods imbue it upon you, like the Greeks and the Romans, or the Norse? Or is it something that's born in you, like a sorcerer, to use a Dungeons and Dragons term? Or is it a wizard, where it's a learned thing, where you go away and learn to capture this magic? And if you do, what is those schools of magic like? And are you limited? Are you not limited? Are you stealing energy from some other place and putting it somewhere else? Or is it just conjured out of you? Do you become weak when you cast it, or are you emboldened when you do? And all that stuff, all of those details, everything down to coats of arms and sigils for houses, and the politics of it. What does governance look like? Is there free will? Is there slavery? Is there, like in my world, I've got 7 baronies that have come together to create the Kingdom of Warminster. But it wasn't done by a war, it's done by a vote. So there's a democratic republic, in a sense, by these barons, that they've chosen a family to rule them as part of that. Or, where does the currency come from? Like, one of the things that bothers me about Star Trek and Star Wars is they have the same currency. It's a credit. You know what I mean? Anything,
Mm-hmm.
you would go back to Battlestar Galactica, credit, 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 or D&D. Everyone has a gold piece, or a gold whatever. So take your time and create your own currency. So in my world, sure, there's gold, but it's called a palmette, or the silver laurel, or a copper sheaf. Give it a name of something that makes it sound like it's something that you own. And in my world, everything is minted at Kingswell, and it's a place where it's minted. So there's no counterfeit stuff. Now there is, but there isn't, and they
Mm-hmm.
try to keep it that way. And that way there's not hundreds of different pieces of coins and stuff like that. Or, when you find, that you're creating these races, don't use the same races. So sure, I use elves, but mine are vermilion, which are red-haired, red-eyed, alabaster skin, the name vermilion coming from the color.
Mm-hmm.
Or raven elves, the color of their hair, it has, it's black, raven colored in it, and it's feathered like a raven would. Or, the emerald dales, those elves have mint green hair, and stuff like that, and green eyes, and have this green tint to them because of the place of the world they come from. But I don't have any dwarves. You know what I mean? I don't have halflings or hobbits. You know, so I've created Huldrefolk or Twergs or something else for these demi races that are part of the realm. And those things add character to it. It also adds believability to it. It's something that other people might liken to something else they've seen, but it's something that I own, that my world owns. You know, that's unique to Warminster, and I can do that with monsters too, man. Like, make sure your monsters are things that, yeah, maybe I've kind of seen that somewhere else, but this is a cool version of it that I like it a little bit better, or something out of the blue, right? And so I think those kind of things I use, you know, when I'm looking on the structured piece. Like, here's a bunch of stuff that makes your world believable. What's my religion like? What's my politics like? Where's my money come from? What are the economics of the society? How does it run? You know, and then on the other side, you've got this fantasy world that you can create whatever you want in there. So, like, is your magic prevalent, or is it sword and sorcery where it's just a little tiny bit that every now and then you see Conan find some sort of magic that either curses him or saves him, but everything else is like a real world. You know, it's almost like a magical realism that's been sprinkled into it. Like, you know, are you playing way up here, or are you playing way down here? And, you know, also, you know, are you talking with humans, or that's the only thing you have? Like in Westeros, everybody is basically a form of human. There's no magical things except for the extreme magic that you find at the wall, or, of course, with the White Walkers and stuff like that too, that come in, or dragons, of course. You know, and so what do you have in your world, and build that up, and then make sure that it fits together. So you've got this clean slate of creativity that you can do anything with, and then to ground it in magic, or ground it in realism, so people can suspend disbelief. You add those things so that they can see structure and that it makes sense to them.
Mm-hmm. So to me, it sounds like you first built essentially a copywriter's version of a swipe file, where most copywriters will have a bunch of text that they really like to say, "Ooh, I loved this headline," or "I loved how they worded this thing," or this. Just they have a bunch of stuff they can refer back to say, "I like how I remember that I remember how this headline went. I want to go back and look at that to see how can I implement that in this project or in this thing that they're doing." Except you have a fiction fantasy version of that for your world building, where it might be maps, characters, monsters, plot ideas, just all of that tucked away in who knows how many binders. I'm not going to ask, but
way too many.
Yeah. So just from the way you were explaining it, it sounds like you take more of a top-down approach to world building, starting with the big picture of what's the pantheon, or what's the continent, the kingdoms, and slowly working down towards the smaller aspects of it. Is that sort of on the right trail?
Yeah, you have to go big to granular, right? And so you start out at 30,000 feet and understand what the realm is like. And then as you get, you know, closer and closer and closer to the ground, then things become more real. So how do they interact? You know, how do they all come together? And so I think that's an important piece, not just a world building, but to make it realistic, right? So, like, I tell people this all the time. If you're writing a contemporary fiction novel, you can say that Joe got in the car and drove down the street, and we all know what that's like. But in a fantasy realm or a sci-fi realm, is Joe human? You know, is there gravity? What does the car? Are there cars, or is he in a horse and buggy, or is he in a spaceship, or, you know, was he teleported there? Like, you have to tell me those things, and so you have to build them into your world. So tell me what your world looks like. Tell me what those cities look like, and also, you know, don't tell me, show me. You know, show me through character reactions, show me through experiential things, or in media res, where you're just dropping right into a scene, and you're there, and let me experience it coming at me at bursts. You know, and as a reader, I think that's more fun than being the exposition of it all, where I'm just saying, oh, here I'm telling you what Castleshire looks like, and there's 3 pages of what the cityscape looks like. Let me experience it as a reader, and I think and then everybody has their own experience, right? That's why I think that, you know, when someone reads a book and then goes sees a movie, the book is always better, because the book is perfect. You know, you constructed it in your head, and everybody looks the way you look. Everything happened the way you think it is. Then you go and see a movie. And the example I use all the time is, you know, I'm a big fan of the Jack Reacher stuff, and Lee Child writes, you know, hundreds of books. That's an exaggeration, but you get my point. And Jack Reacher is this monster of a man, and then you go see the movie, and 5'6" Tom Cruise is cast as Jack Reacher, and it just doesn't make sense, right? You know, and so yeah, but, you know, hey, great actor, did a good job in the movie, but I'm sitting there the entire movie saying, why is Tom Cruise Jack Reacher? Can't you find someone that's a football player or a basketball player to play this giant of a man?
Mm-hmm.
And you see that adjustment. The same thing goes for our stuff, right? So I think that being able to show it instead of telling it helps build that world. It helps immerse people in it because then they're there when that sword clangs off of their shield, or when the crackle of magic from the spell that went off behind them raises the hair on the back of their neck. They're living that. They're not being told the fireball shot over their head. Instead they feel something, they smell something, and they're right there with the characters as things are happening. And I think that makes for a better novel.
Mm-hmm. So as you're working on expanding out the world, as you're working on the plot, I'm trying to figure out the best way to phrase this, but an idea that I've seen work quite well for a number of people is essentially laying the train tracks down as they're going, or they're building out the world as the characters are moving their way through it. Do you do some of that, or do you try to do more, like build the world first, then place the characters in it, or I don't know how to best phrase this question.
I got you. I know
Yeah.
exactly where you're going, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's three types of authors.
Mm-hmm.
There are the planners, which are plotters like me,
Mm-hmm.
that not only built the train tracks, but also built the cities on the opposite side of the train tracks, know what the trains look like, everything before they start to write the story,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I'm out there plotting away, and I have engineered my biggest part of writer's block happens in the beginning because I'm assembling this world. And then when the world is ready to go, then I drop the characters in, just like you described. So
Okay.
now I know where the characters fold into this. And, if you saw, my plot for this is my plan. I literally have graph paper with it looks like a March Madness
Mm-hmm.
Sweet 16 poll where all these character and plot arcs come together for this final epic thing. And as it happens, I scratch them off or erase them, and then they're all baked into the novel. Then there are pantsers. And
Mm-hmm.
pantsers are those that fly by the seat of their pants, right? And they will write like Stephen King's perfect example of that, where like the guy just starts to write and can write 5 chapters, and then he'll get stuck in the middle of somewhere because he doesn't know where he wants to go because there were no train tracks.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are the plantsers, which is what you've described. You lay down some train tracks, introduce some characters, you get on the tracks and you go a little bit farther, and then you decide what you're going to do. You know what I mean? And I think there are 3 writing styles as part of that. Most people are a hybrid. I unfortunately am a plotter to my core.
Mm-hmm.
So, I can't get away with that. I have a hard time writing unless I know where I'm going. And so your train tracks might be laid, but I need to know what city I'm going to. So I'm writing in that direction. And that's what helps me. Other people do it. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. Like everybody, they're successful authors, but have been, parts of all 3 of them. The way I do it is really extreme planning. And maybe that plays into a little bit of my obsessive compulsive disorder or something like that, where, I just need to know things or else I freeze up. And I think that's the way I write. So it works for me, but I think that there's a variety of authors that can do every little increment along that same timeline.
Mm-hmm. So when you're working on a plot, where do you typically start with that?
For me, it's the idea, right? At the core, right? Is this something that's believable? Would I read it? Would I buy it? And have I seen it somewhere else before? Right. And so, like, I don't mind borrowing inspiration from something. We all get that. Like, I describe my stuff as like Dracula meets Game of Thrones meets Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
You said, hey, it's more like Brandon Sanderson meets Witcher. Neither of us are wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's something that I've taken probably inspiration from all of that kind of stuff. So for me, when I start to put together a plot, it really starts with the intersection of an idea that I have, and whether it's a scene that I saw or the outcome. Like I see the ending before I saw the beginning, and then I kind of reverse engineer and work my way back. So sometimes, like, I knew how the 4th novel was going to end before I knew how the 2nd novel was going to begin. Right? It was like I was at the end, and I went back to the beginning, and then I started filling in the parts in the middle. Now, again, maybe that's my writing style, and not everybody writes that way. Some people can write very linearly, like from the beginning and to the end, where I'm doing the reverse engineering stuff, or some facsimile thereof. But for me, that's what works, and at least in my world, and it's hard for me to break away from that. So I keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. But it's popular and people like it, so I'll keep
Whatever
on
works for
trucking
you.
along. Yeah, right.
I feel like that's the answer for everything that authors do. It's find the thing that works for you and just keep going until it breaks and hope it
That's
doesn't
right.
break.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm. So you said that when you were first submitting this to your publisher that they said, "Oh no, this is going to be a trilogy, not one book." And that sort of brings up another idea of when do you know when it's done?
Yeah. So for me, I kind of knew the end, like I just described. Like I knew where I
Mm-hmm.
was writing toward, and that helped me. And the end was so powerful. Uh, and I just got it back from my editor, and he's like, "You stuck the landing." And I was like, "I knew I wanted you to read all the way up to that point just for that ending piece, and you know when it ends." But to the greater point, the point that you're really asking is there always more? And the answer is yes, right? And I think there's two ways to answer that question. There is the continuation of the story, which is everybody's bought in. Now I'm in the realm of Warminster. I understand the realm of Warminster, and you've ended it after 4 books. So what's next for me? I love these characters. I love the realm. I want more. So is there going to be another series of 3 or 4 books? Yes, right. Or what I'm doing right now to sate readers in between series is origin stories of their favorite characters, so they can see the background of what happened to the big bad evil guy or what happened to their favorite hero and things like that as they read through and why they became who they became and the stories behind it that may have been alluded to in the beginning as you saw them mature as characters throughout. And I think that's something that's one answer to your question. The other answer to your question is, as authors, you always want to tweak. You're never not done, right? You're never done. It's one of those things where you're just going in there saying to yourself, I could make this better. And when I read my first novel, I always going to go back, and there are things that I would love to change about it. But
Yep.
you know, I got approached by a publishing house to switch over. They're like, hey, we're mid market, we're a little bit bigger than where you are, but this is what we want to do with your books. We want to divide them up, make them smaller, and allow you to kind of build from there, rebuild it, and kind of relaunch them. And I thought about it, and then I watched a J.R.R. Tolkien interview where he said that he was asked to go back and change some of the things that he thought he might have screwed up. And he said, nope, that's the story. That's the story, and I'm sticking to it, and I'm not going back, even though, sure, there may have been errors, and I might have had to write a certain way because I didn't do things I wanted to, or I didn't think about them in the beginning, and I could perfect it, but no. And so I keep telling myself the discipline of Tolkien, which is a story, and sometimes stories, sure, they could all be. I mean, we could sit there and talk. You and I can spend an hour tonight talking about Star Wars 1, 2, and 3, 7, 8, and 9, and what was wrong with them. But in the end, I'm going to watch every Star Wars thing that comes on Disney. I don't care what it is, right? I don't care what it is. I'm going to watch it. I might complain about it, and it's not perfect, and I didn't like the casting of this or how that ended, or the storyline here looked too familiar, or the storyline there didn't make sense, or I don't understand what they're doing, and that used to be canon. It's not canon anymore. It doesn't matter, right? I love it. So you're in it. And so even though the flaws are there, it's okay. So for me, I wish I could go back and change it, but I'm living my life through the Tolkien discipline.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping that, the next series that comes out is just better than the first series that I wrote.
Yeah, fair enough. So, as you're looking at your life as an author so far, if you had to break down the 80/20 of what it takes to be a successful author, what do you think that 80/20 would look like?
Mm. So I used the term before, resilience,
Mm-hmm.
and I hate to go back to it. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of mental discipline to keep you writing. And that's most of it. Like, I think that the storytelling and the creative juices are the easy part, right? That's the part where it's just, you either have it or you don't. It's a good story or it isn't. And if you know you've got a good story, do you have the discipline, the mental acuity to sit down and write something and spend time doing it in that format, that medium, and getting it across where people will enjoy it. And at the end, it's not about, is it a good book or not? It's, are you entertained? It doesn't have to be the best book. I mean, this is nothing against her, but the Twilight series wasn't great books, right? It wasn't great American literature, but it was really popular and people were entertained by it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it was successful, and that's okay. And that's all you really need, right? And so if people read it and they're like, oh, I really like this, I'm going to read the next, then you've won. So for me, it's just having that mental fortitude, that intestinal fortitude to sit down and say, I'm going to finish this project and I'm going to get on to the next, and set goals for yourself and reach them. And then continue to become better at your craft as you're doing it. But letting that creative juice around it, that to me is the cherry on top. The rest of that stuff, the cake, is really, having the discipline to get it done. Because not everybody that sets out to write, not everybody finishes.
Mm-hmm. I want to say there are fewer people in proportion when you look at people who want to write books compared to those who did. There are fewer people who, like, that proportion is smaller compared to those who have written books and are best-selling authors. So typically, if you write a book, your chances of becoming a best-selling author are better than those of people who say, I want to write a book, actually writing a book.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
It's a real good point.
So, yeah. So you mentioned discipline. Discipline is so crucial to accomplishing and trying to do anything. What have you done over the years to try to develop that discipline more, to be able to actually sit down and just do the thing?
Yeah. So for me, as I said before, the silver lining in COVID was I didn't have anything else to do. So I had a lot of time on my hands. And then, as an obsessive compulsive, once you start it, you continue it has to go, it has to go, it has to go. The train started to move. You broke that inertia,
Mm-hmm.
and now you're moving, and you got to just keep repeating, right? So for me, there's part of me that my own mental disability helps me do it because I can't not do it, right?
Blessing and a
It's always like,
curse.
so it's a blessing and a curse. And I think that that's good. But also, I think that you, as an author, if you're writing a good story, you also want to see the end of it, right? And so you want to get to the parts where you want, like, I wanted to write this ending so bad that I wrote the first 3 novels so I could just write this,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's all I wanted, was the end of this novel, because the series of novels, because I knew that would be the killer, and people would be like, oh, and there's and I've got the Luke, I am your father moment in book 2, and all this other kind of stuff that kind of comes out of nowhere and catches you on, and all that was fun to write, but it all led to this culmination, this epic battle in the end, epic good versus evil kind of stuff. And that was the part where that drove me to write that. And that kind of stuff, I think, helps you kind of pull it along. Where you want to go. And, it's a matter of getting there and hammering away at it so that you can write the thing that you want to write. And now it's like I'm starting over, and
Mm-hmm.
I got to figure out what that end is for the next series, so that I'm excited about writing towards that. So that's where I'm stuck right now. That's why I'm doing these origin stories in the middle. I'm trying to buy myself some time to come up with that next epic ending.
Ah, fair enough. Makes sense. So, something I like to do on this show is I like to talk about skills and how they can branch out to affect other areas of your life, and how other areas of your life can affect the skills you're working on here. So sort of a back to back set of questions is, what were some unexpected skills that have helped you along as a writer and getting published?
Yeah. So one is, I would describe this as an entrepreneurial drive.
Mm-hmm.
I've always wanted to own my own businesses, and I likened my authorship to owning my own business. So unlike looking at it from an art form, which I do and I'm proud of, I also look at it as I am my brand and my books are my product. And in order for me to hit bestseller status, I have to sell X amount of books. How do I get there? And that comes through exposure. And that exposure comes through publication and publicists and social media and getting out to conventions and book signings and going to look. I've gone to libraries where 3 people have shown up, and this weekend I'll be in Richmond for GalaxyCon, and there'll be 40,000 people there over a 3-day period. Right? That's clearly better exposure for me, but that's the win, right? You grind it out, and you look up and say, all right, well, you know what? I added 3 good names to my emailing list this week. So when I sell that next book, I'm out there pushing it, I know I've got 3 more people that are going to buy it. And now, you add those and add those, and you just keep that up. And so I've almost business planned it like I've done my other businesses to make sure that I've reached my goals. And sometimes when you look at a business plan, you know where you're slipping, right? And you're like, all right, well, I didn't sell as many books as I thought. What's the problem? You go back and diagnose the problem, and you make it better, and things like that. So perfect example of one was when you're a new author, you're very sensitive to your reviews.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my first 20 reviews that I got, like legitimate reviews, not my mom saying it's the greatest book I ever read, but legitimate, independent third-party objective reviews, came from a woman who said, I wanted to love this book and I bought it for its cover, did not finish, 2 stars. And for a while there, I was like, what did I do wrong? I was, sulking over it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I can't believe I got a 2-star review. And then all of a sudden it clicked that she bought it for the cover, so the covers are important. For my business plan, I want to make sure I have kick ass covers, right? Because if we, and really it comes down to that, right? So you go into a bookstore and you walk into a sci-fi fantasy shelf. What are you looking for? If you go in there and you find something that looks like a romance novel, you're not going to pick it up because you're a sci-fi fantasy reader. So that the covers have to look like your genre
Mm-hmm.
overall. And then they've got to pop enough that you reach and grab that book. And even what's on the front cover doesn't have to be anything that's on those pages. It just has to make you grab that book. And the next thing you do, once you've been entranced by the book cover, is you turn it over and you read the blurb, right? And the blurb in that 250 words is going to tell you what's in that book and does this match up with what I want to read. And if it's close enough, okay, then I'm going to open up and read that prologue. I'm going to read that first chapter. Then I'm going to go to the register with that book. Same thing happens on Amazon or some other, format of distribution where you go there. And so people sometimes don't think about that, and they'll design their own covers and then they don't work, or they don't understand why using a certain font on a cover means more to the sale of a book than it does, even though you might be artistically inclined to pick something else. It doesn't matter what you think. It only matters what the reader thinks. And so you'll walk into a suspense thing, and there's always a guy in an overcoat carrying a briefcase standing under a light at night somewhere. And it's like, they all look the same. Well, they all look the same because that's what the readers expect when they get there. And
Mm-hmm.
so it doesn't matter what I want. It matters what the readers want. And once you divorce yourself from that and say, this is a product, and I've got to sell it. So I'm selling it to the people that are going to buy it. And even though my friends might have bought it the first time out because they're my friends, they're not my readers. I got to hit those readers. And who are they? And it's understanding their demographics. It's how to reach them, what they're looking for, and what they like. And once you get that formula down, you can sell them a mediocre product, but you reached them and they're okay. They'll take it, as opposed to something that might be superior, but they never knew that because they didn't open the cover. They didn't get past the cover that didn't match what their expectations were, or the blurb that didn't use the word harrowing or adventurous or villain or epic in it, and things like that. When you do your word cloud, I didn't even know what a word cloud was until I tried writing a blurb.
Mm-hmm.
There's a word cloud, and stuff like that. You grab that and run with it. And I think that's the kind of thing that helps me is I've learned to business plan it in a way I would business plan my other businesses to find profitability. This is a different kind of profitability.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. People hate the saying, don't judge a book by its cover, but people will always judge a book by its cover. If it doesn't catch the eye, it's not going to get sold. And there's a reason why many of the best written books are not the same as the best selling books. Because
Right.
people who focus only on the writing aspect of it, which, yes, that is very important. If you don't have a book that reads well, people aren't going to finish it and they're going to complain. But if you don't have good marketing to it, if you don't have a good book cover, if you don't have anything out there to push people to say, hey, look at this book that I have, I think you're going to like it, if that doesn't exist, no one's going to find it. And
Yep.
then it's almost as if you never wrote the book at all.
Yeah, and that's a shame. Whether you're doing it for the art of it and you don't care how many you sell, or whether you're doing it as a career and you need to hit numbers to sell so you can put food on your table. You've got to follow certain principles, even though I might not like it. And I would love to have different covers than I do, but the covers I have sell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So outside of so business skills have been extremely helpful with you trying to grow your authoring and publishing career. What have been some of the like how has developing your authorship helped you outside of the world of writing?
Yeah. So one, it's taught me to be patient. So there's things my publisher told me from day one. She said, you could have the best book ever as your first book out of the gate. You're never going to make money on it. And she said, your second book, you're not going to make money on that either. Your third book, people start paying attention to you, and we might start making a little money on that third book. But the fourth book is when people now are familiar with you and they're going to be invested in the series, and they're going to pull you along, and they're going to expect more and more and more. And so, what she was really saying is readership takes time to build. It's just like anything else, right? You're laying a foundation, and not everybody's going to buy you, and they'll give you every excuse in the book. And some of them are very legitimate. Like some people will buy, they've told me, don't sell me your series until it's done, and then
Mm-hmm.
I'll read it because I'm going to read all the way through. And they're waiting for it patiently, and that's how some buyers react. They're not, they're unhappy with authors that start a series and never finish it. And so they want to make sure you're actually going to finish it, and things like that. So you have to be patient for that. You also have to understand that we're not world beaters. Like, I don't have Stephen King's marketing team. I'm not going to be, I can't just say, here's my book and people are going to buy it. They've got to find you in a sea of people that are doing this. So, I think indie authors, one of the things they struggle with a lot is 80,000 new books a month hit Amazon. You multiply that by 12 months, multiply that by 15 years of people have been buying books on Amazon. You're awash in a sea of it. So how do you stick out? What is going to make you stick out amongst that? And you have to grind that out. You have to build your following on social media. You have to build your following on things like podcasts, radio shows, TV shows, hitting the road, going to a 12-person book club in their home where they're handing you cookies and tea, all the way to, being an author that's going to speak at a Comic-Con or GalaxyCon or a horror con, and getting in there and getting exposure in front of a bunch of people, and your geekdom, your nerddom, you want to get in front of as many people as you can. And that sometimes takes time, and it's an investment. Like, those things are not free. Like, it costs me money to get a hotel room and fly to these places and per diems to eat while I'm there. And so just to make table, to break even, I've already got a nut that I got to make. So it's like, all right, I've got to sell that just to break even. And there are some intangibles you take away from that too, which are things like, I now have exposure and people know me, and I've got, 90 new people that are on my mailing list that I didn't have before I came to this event, or, people are talking about me, and, I'm being positioned as a subject matter expert at some of the breakout sessions, and, and things like that weren't there in the beginning. And you see that slow progression, and it's with that slow progression, if you're patient enough, it will come. And when my third book came out, my first book became a bestseller. And I'm hoping when the fourth book comes out, it pulls the rest of them across that line, because now people are going to say, I'm in, and I want to be in. And I think that just takes time and patience, and you have to be active. I tell people that all the time, because they're not just going to come to you, because there's just too much there. You might find that one person that stumbles on you by accident and buys your stuff and loves it, but they don't have a voice either. So you've got to scream about everything. It doesn't matter. Hey, my book trailer's coming out, or hey, I got an award for this, or I'll be speaking here, and nobody cares. But that consistent drumming of a message will eventually leak you up on those SEOs, and it'll also help you with those reviews, where you get more reviews, which will push the sales algorithms, which pushes free publicity, and that's what you really need. So it's really building blocks after building blocks.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. You touched on so many very important things there, not just for being successful as an author, but for people trying to be successful probably in business in general, that patience is so important. And one thing that you touched on is that you have to be out there screaming from the rooftops to get anyone to see your thing. I can think of maybe one or two people who can actually pull off the if they build it, it will come mentality. Maybe like Elon Musk is probably one of the few people where if he makes something,
Right.
people will come to it. You're not Elon Musk, I'm not Elon Musk. If we make something, people aren't just gonna come aren't just gonna come and find it. Like, that doesn't happen. So absolutely have like being able to have the drive, being able to say, I'm going to put in this investment to try to make this thing work. Like, I've seen the same exact thing with me trying to grow this podcast. Like, absolutely nothing would happen if I did not actively go out and try to find people to talk to. If I did not actively try to share it on social media, if I did not go out and do these things and try to treat it like a business, nothing would happen with it. It would just be me talking to a void. But because I'm out going and doing those things, it's the same thing as what happens with authors. You go out, and maybe one or two people will meet you at first. Like, one or two people will find you. Like, okay. Then you find a couple more and a few more, and slowly but surely over time, as you produce more, as you write more, as you just do more and are more prevalent, if you do enough screaming, eventually a crowd will come. But only once you scream yourself hoarse.
Yeah, that's true. And and two guys that are as sexy as us, it's easy to go out there and get crowds to follow us, right?
Oh, so easy. Yep. Just walking around, just mobs of people all over. So I want to dig into a bit more of this business side of publishing,
Sure.
since you've had an experience to be able to license some of your works, be able to do more with your works than I think many people have even considered. So you've mentioned that you're trying to license your IP for games and graphic novels, and I'd love to hear more about that, since it's an avenue that most authors never even consider. So what can you tell me a bit about that experience?
Yeah, sure. So the the video game came to me based on stuff we just got done talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I was out there hustling. The guy came to, Comic Con, grabbed my book, read it, called me a couple of days later and said, you know what? I like what you got here, and I own a video game company, and what would it take to license your intellectual property? And so, I, you know, stunned, like you just said, you're like, you're not sure that that's really going to happen. And, and all of a sudden you get lawyers involved and there's a deal done. And, and that's, to me, what really, now you get to see your product or your art form take another medium. And video games are a lot different than books, right?
Mm-hmm.
So video games, you have the freedom to do things that you're not going to see, in your book, or sometimes, like, as I'm being part of the storyboarding process, there are parts of the book that get sliced out because they can't fit into a video game. So to create things that go into the video game that you might decide that you're going to fight the heroes, you're going to be the bad guy as opposed to the good guy, and take a different tact on things, and that game has to be ready for that. Where my book doesn't have that. It's linear. This is my story, and this is exactly how it goes all the time. And so part of the storyboarding is I've had to give up some things that I like. I had to kill my own darlings to make a better video game. And the same thing holds true for graphic novels. Like the graphic novels, imagine taking an epic fantasy novel and taking my 150,000 words and literally making them 8 squares on 2 separate pages with maybe 3 to 5 words in each square. Those, each of those frames, and now you've got to take what I've described in three paragraphs or 3 pages and drop it in on these frames and show it with one person's face. And they do it by showing something from the ground looking up, or something from the air looking down, or like wobbles in a person showing that they're nervous, and things like that. And it's just a different medium. And so it's humbling to see your art form take those different forms of media, but also, there's something to be said about that. Now I might be able to go out and sell more books to the gamers that are buying my stuff, because they're going to be buying the game or downloading the game. And when they get it, they're going to say, oh, that's cool. I'm going to go read this stuff and see how lifelike it is against it. And we've even baked in some nice nuggets in there for folks to find, some Easter eggs, where if you haven't read the books, you don't know how to solve the stuff. Right. And so it drives people to the books to, in fact, solve the quest within the game. And in the graphic novels, same thing. You might have someone that loves comic books but will never pick up a novel that has 150,000 words or 500 pages in it. They'll be intimidated by it. But they read the graphic novel, they're like, oh, well, I got the gist of this story and I like this. And so I'm going to follow this author. I'm going to buy this and have it on my shelf. I might never read it, but I'm going to support that author, or I'm going to buy his swag because I played his game or I read his comic book. And, that's my medium. That's where I get entertained. I go through those things. And so seeing that eventually grow into these multiple buckets allows me to get my story into other places, even if it's been tainted a bit through, poetic licensure, where someone has to make it a little different. And as long as you're willing to concede that and say, no, it just can't be, it has to be Tom Cruise in my movie, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
throw Tom Cruise under the bus again tonight. But instead, it can't be that. I've got to say, you know what? Your medium better than I do. I'm not going to tell you how to build a video game, but if you're using my story, here's the rubric around here. I'm going to put some ground rules. Here's some guide rails. Stay within here and then do whatever you want with it, because then it's at least relevant to what I've written. And the story comports with the storyline that I've written. And I think that's really all I can ask, and let them do their magic, because they're better at that than I will ever be. And I would hope the same thing would hold true on the novel side, where I'm going to be a better writer than a video game maker.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Networking is so crucial to be able to go out and get many of these opportunities. And I wanted to bring this up earlier, but I just remembered it now. But as you're going out and you're marketing your book, as you're trying to push these things out there, I remembered a quote from someone that when you're starting off anything, one of the most important things you can do is say yes to almost everything. Then once you eventually hit a certain level, it's learning how to switch that to start saying no to more things. For example, I'm guessing currently you probably don't go to maybe individual book clubs where you're meeting with one or two or three people. Maybe you are still, I don't know. But as any business or as any brand grows, eventually it's switching from saying yes to almost everything to saying no to so many more things, and being able to see the opportunity cost of all those things that you're doing. like the opportunity cost of you joining up with people to make graphic novels, to make video games from your IP, that's a very high leverage thing. That's going to do very well. It's probably going to do very well for you, and it's going to be able to share your world and your world and your stories with more people because, like you said, many people might not be interested in diving into a 500-page book to read some fantasy novel, but they might be much happier to pick up a video game to play, to sink 100 hours into, or they might be happier to pick up a graphic novel to really just sort of get the bare bones, get into that. Then maybe afterwards they'll say, yeah, that was pretty good. I'll try it. I'll try this out. So it's being able to look at your various opportunities and, one, talk to people to make sure you can get those opportunities in the first place, and two, see if those opportunities are actually going to be good for you to do. So it's cool what can happen once you start expanding your network like that.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I mean, you sometimes outgrow certain things, but you never forget where you came from.
Mm-hmm.
It's humbling, and I'll go back to people that had me out the first time. Anytime they asked me to come back, on a show, or anytime they asked me to come to their readers club, because if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be where I am. But then there are others that are hard to get to that you have to pass up because greater opportunities exist elsewhere, and you're making a business decision to say, well, I can either go to this, like, I have a perfect example. I'm part of this GalaxyCon troop that goes through the GalaxyCon. There's 5 cons throughout the course of the year, and you visit each of those cities. On one of those visits, there is a con in my hometown that is much smaller. And even though it'd be easier for me just to go to my convention center and do it, I'm only going to see a quarter, maybe a fifth of the people I would see the GalaxyCon circuit. So even though I'm a hometown boy and I want to eventually go there, they always align on the same weekends. And so I'll never go there because I need to be in front of 60,000 people or 50,000 people as opposed to 10,000 people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's sad, but it happens.
Yeah.
So starting to wrap this up, I want you to just look at the aspiring author, the people who have ideas in their heads. How can they go from the idea in their head to published with a complete book in hand? What are some of the most basic, fundamental steps to take them from 0 to 100?
Yeah. All right. So I've got a few of those. The first is, I mentioned it before, muscle memory. Write something every day, no matter how small it is, no matter insignificant you think it is, it'll create the habit of writing. And I think that's important. Number two is you have to be open to constructive criticism. Iron sharpens iron, right? And sometimes you're too close to something to understand that you're kind of nose blind to things. In your head, the scene might have already happened, and you forget to put it in the novel. And one of your beta readers are going to point that out, or a critic is going to point that out, and you're going to say, "Wow, they were right." But if you listen to that, that's a mistake you won't make again, right? And so instead of taking it and saying, "Well, I'm going to throw that out," consider it first. You might disagree. You might say, "You know what? They're wrong, and I like the way I write, or I like the way this is written, or how the story played out." And other times you're going to realize if you take a real step back from it and pull yourself out of being subjective and be objective, chances are they're telling you that because they're trying to help you, and that makes you a better writer. So that's part two. Part three is forget the entire concept of, am I good enough to be a writer? There's that syndrome that's out there that people that they run into it all the time, where they think they're an imposter. Like, is this good enough to be published? Am I good enough to be considered an author? Did you write something? Then you're an author, right? So I tell people that it was written by you. That makes you an author, no matter how small. It could be a poem. It could be a short story. It could be a Vela episode. It could be whatever. As long as you do it, you've done it. And it doesn't have to be published for you to be an author, right? It could just be a nice journal entry somewhere. But ultimately, I think imposter syndrome paralyzes people sometimes, and they worry about what other people are going to think. It doesn't matter, right? If you look at it and say, I'm just going to do it, and I want to get this out of my head and onto a piece of paper or onto a Word document that's going to be published somewhere. It doesn't matter if everybody likes it, because not everybody's going to like it. There's a lot of romance readers out there that will never pick up my books because I have a little bit of romance in them, and I might be able to fake them, say there's fantasy romance in there and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But people like what they like, and they don't like what they don't like. And as long as you accept that, and you're like, all right, that you're not my reader, you're not my target market, you'll move on from that. And it's hard to do in the beginning. You know what I mean? It's hard to do because you want everybody to like your stuff. It doesn't happen that way. So get that out of your head entirely as part of that. And the last thing I would say is another point that we brought up before. You got to grind. You got to grind. In the beginning, you're going to have 40 followers. You know what I mean? You're going to start out and you're going to be like, oh my God, no one's following me back on my X account. No one's following my Facebook because they don't know who I am. And all of a sudden that's going to be 10, and then it's going to be 100, and then it's going to be 300. And all of a sudden you're the one that's looking to say, should I follow this person or not? And that just builds over time. So you've got to just grind it out and put in the time to do that, because there's no shortcut to it. If we were Elon Musk and I could put my name on it and people would buy it because I have a name, sure. But 99% of us don't have that name. So you've got to build it, and that just takes time. So be patient, grind it out, do what you got to do to get there. And then at the end of the day, if you follow those things, I think you'll overcome a lot of those fears and a lot of that anxiety and get you to a point where you'll be happy where you are within a year.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I agree with you on all of those points. There's probably nothing else I would add to that, just because you summed it up quite well. Are there any other recommended tools or resources for authors or publishers that you'd say, check these out, they might help?
Well, sure. I mean, we mentioned a little earlier about beta readers. Get a good group of beta readers. You can find them online, join Facebook groups, join reader groups, and then exchange work. I've even encouraged people to go to like a community college and take classes, because you're in a class of people that are going to be reading your stuff, and sometimes they don't read your stuff either. And so they're going to point out flaws that you don't see, and vice versa. You're doing it for them. And, and I would, let's face it, read your genre, know what's contemporary. There are things, and the perfect example for fantasy is, when Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, it was okay to write a book that was basically about Nordic white men, right? And majority of main characters in it were that, right? Fantasy has morphed over the years, and now it's not okay to write a book that doesn't have differences in race. It's not okay to write a book that doesn't have differences in sexuality. It's not write a book, but a lot of these social mores that we now embrace, that we didn't embrace 100 or 80 years ago. And now that we're there, now you've got to understand that even though Tolkien might have inspired you, you got to write for today's audience. And so read contemporary stuff, be current when you're writing it, so it's easy for folks out there to accept, and know what those waves are, right? And if you ride the white wave, like there was a vampire, everybody was writing vampire novels after Twilight, and then there was the dystopian stuff that happened after Hunger Games, and there's always waves out there. And if your stuff catches the right wave, it's easier for you to get those sales and become more popular, which will advance your authorship as part of that. I'm not saying you have to do it. That might not be what you're writing, but if you would at least identify it, and you might want to write in that, you find some inspiration, want to do it, that's something that can also carry you forward. Go with the flow, with that current momentum that's out there. Don't fight that unless you really want to, for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm. Joe, it's been absolutely wonderful to speak to you today. I wish you the best of luck with Echoes of Ghostwood. I'm looking forward to it, and just can't wait to read it. It's been a pleasure. Where can people go to see more from you, and is there anything that you'd like to plug?
Yeah, well, I'm easy to find, right? So jvhilliard.com, or go to dragonmoonpress.com, and you can buy my books there. But if you're an Amazon shopper, you can find it in about 20 different places, right? So you could find hardback, paperback. You'll be able to find ebook and audiobook. Just look for Warminster Saga, Last Keeper, or JV Hilliard, and you'll be able to find me. And also, if you want to chat, if there's anything you do, I'm really easy to find. Joe at jvhilliard.com. You can email me. I try to get back to everybody within a 24-hour period, or you can reach me on my socials, which are primarily at JV Hilliard Books as a handle for Twitter, X, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and then just JV Hilliard on Facebook and Discord.
Awesome. Once again, it's been a pleasure having you come on today, so thanks.
It has been my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. I enjoy it, and I'm looking forward to reading some of your stuff now.
Okay, ciao. If you enjoyed this episode, then please share it with a friend you think would like it, or share it on social media. It would absolutely mean the world to me, and it helps the podcast grow so much. With all that said, thanks for listening. I greatly appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.